Hello, welcome to this last and final session of the summary of Charles Dickens' novel Pickwick Papers. During our first two sessions, we have described the Pickwickians' adventures across the countryside of England outside the city of London. At this point in the summary of the novel, we have arrived at a pivotal moment in the novel, a very important moment in the story of the novel. That is, the case, the trial for the lawsuit filed by Mrs. Bardell. Mrs. Bardell has accused Mr. Samuel Pickwick of breach of promise of marriage. And after Mr. Pickwick returns from his Christmas celebration at Dingley Dell, this trial takes place. On behalf of the petitioner, that is Mrs. Bardell, the advocate Sergeant Bosphorus argues in the court, and Sergeant Bosphorus presents argument to prove Mrs. Bardell's innocence, and at the same time he argues to prove Mr. Pickwick's villainy. He presents various witnesses and he is ultimately able to convince the jury, and the jury finally pronounced the judgment, and Mr. Samuel Pickwick is asked to pay £750 as compensation for the damage for the breach of promise of marriage to Mrs. Bardell. The trial is full of comic episodes, especially Mr. Sergeant Bosphorus' rhetorical arguments, his absurd interpretations of Mr. Pickwick's speeches, conversation with Mrs. Bardell. Only Sam Weller, as a witness, claims Mr. Pickwick's innocence. The other Pickwickians, Tupman, Snodgrass and Winkle, inadvertently, unintentionally contributes to Sergeant Bosphorus' accusation of Mr. Pickwick. When the judgment is pronounced by the jury, Mr. Pickwick gets tremendously angry, and he says that he would prefer to go to the debtor's prison, but would not surrender to this wrong machinations, to this kind of manipulation of the law. This episode of the trial of Mr. Pickwick also shows how the contemporary legal system allowed manipulation of law by the rich and the powerful. Mr. Pickwick is given 2 months' time to pay the £750 to Mrs. Bardell, and if he fails to pay the amount to Mrs. Bardell, after 2 months of time he would be sent to the debtor's prison. Since Mr. Pickwick had 2 months of time, he decides to go to Bath during this period of 2 months. On the journey to Bath, in the coach, Mr. Pickwick meets a gentleman called Captain Dowler. Captain Dowler was accompanied by his wife, Mrs. Dowler. At Bath, the Pickwickians and the Dowlers rent the same apartment and plan to stay there for 2 months. One night, Mrs. Dowler went to a party on a sedan chair, a kind of box, a carriage in the shape of a box. She went out alone in that sedan chair, in that carriage, in that coach, and at midnight she was brought back by the coachman, the sedan chair carriers. While the coachman was knocking at the door of the house, Mr. Dowler was fast asleep. Because of the noise, Mr. Nathaniel Winkle woke up. He goes outside the house wearing only his nightgown, and sees outside that a lady is sitting inside a sedan box, in the sedan chair. And when he finds a lady outside there, he immediately tries to get back into the house. But already, because of the heavy wind, the door has automatically shut, the door has automatically closed. And therefore, although Mr. Winkle wants to get inside the house, he is not able to do so. And in the meantime, in the hue and cry, in the noise, Mr. Dowler woke up, he wakes up, and he comes out and sees outside that his wife is sitting inside the sedan chair, and outside a gentleman is waiting. He immediately thought his wife, Mrs. Dowler, is running away with another gentleman. It was in the dark of night, midnight, therefore Mr. Dowler could not properly recognize Mr. Winkle. In rage, in anger, thinking that his wife is running away with some man, in anger, in rage, Mr. Dowler went in and came back with a dinner knife, with a knife on his hand, and rushed towards the gentleman, who is actually Mr. Winkle. Horrified, Mr. Winkle fled. He flees from that place, and in the morning he arrives at a nearby town called Bristol. In the morning, Mr. Pickwick comes to know about this sudden departure of Mr. Winkle, and he immediately sends Sam to find Mr. Winkle. Following Mr. Winkle's path, Sam arrives at Bristol. While roaming around at Bristol to find Mr. Winkle, Sam accidentally enters a physician's shop. There, inside that physician's shop, Sam Weller finds two gentlemen. The name of the first one is Ben Allen, and the second one is Bob Sawyer. Sam has already met these two persons, Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen, at Dingley Dell during the Christmas celebrations. So, Sam is already known to these two gentlemen. Ben Allen and Bob Sawyer, they have been studying medicine. They have been studying to get the degree of physicians. But although they haven't got the degree of physicians, at Bristol they have hired this room and was playing tricks on people, earning money from people by tricking them and giving them false medicines. When Sam comes out of this chamber of these two gentlemen, Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen, suddenly on the way, Sam meets his sweetheart, Mary. Mary informs Sam that Arabella Allen is also there at Bristol. After some time, Sam is able to find Mr. Winkle, and Sam tells Mr. Winkle that Arabella Allen is also there at Bristol. We have to go back to the episode of the Christmas celebration at Dingley Dell. There, a romantic relationship has already started between Mr. Winkle and Arabella Allen. And when Mr. Winkle comes to know that Arabella Allen is staying in a house at Bristol, Mr. Winkle plans to meet her. Meanwhile, Mr. Pickwick also arrives at Bristol. Mr. Pickwick, after coming to know the presence of Arabella Allen at Bristol, plans to help Mr. Winkle see Arabella Allen. That evening, in the darkness of night, That evening, all of the three persons, Mr. Pickwick, Mr. Winkle and Sam Weller, go to the house where Arabella Allen has been staying. Mr. Pickwick is holding a lantern to show the way to the other two gentlemen, Mr. Sam Weller and Nathaniel Winkle. As Nathaniel Winkle goes near Arabella and they talk, they embrace each other, Mr. Samuel Pickwick is holding the lantern, and this flash of lantern is noticed by a scientific gentleman from a house at a distance. From that distance, when the scientific gentleman sees the flash of light coming from the lantern, the scientific gentleman thinks that it is a strange, mysterious light. The scientific gentleman is not able to recognize that the flash is actually from a lantern. The scientific gentleman thinks that he has discovered a strange flash of electricity, and then he starts writing a paper on this strange discovery of a certain kind of flash of electricity. He writes a paper on this discovery of electricity, a flash of electricity. After this episode in Bristol, the two gentlemen and the other Pickwickians have already passed their 2 months at Bath and Bristol, and at the end of the 2 months, the Pickwickians come back to London. Mr. Pickwick has been in London hardly for 3 days. He has been arrested because, as the judgment is pronounced that he is given only 2 months' time to pay the amount of £750 to Mrs. Bardell. As that period of 2 months gets over, Mr. Pickwick is arrested and he is put into the debtors' prison. Mr. Pickwick's entrance as an inmate of the debtors' prison suddenly shifts the mood of the novel from a comic one to a serious one. From now onwards, for almost another 12 chapters, the novel rests on serious footing. Mr. Pickwick is taken into the debtors' prison as an inmate, and Sam Weller also accompanies him as a servant. Dickens gives a description of the pathetic condition of the debtors' prison in the contemporary England. And this description and this episode of the this description of the debtors' prison in this novel has a touch of autobiography. It is said to be autobiographical in nature, because Dickens' own father was put into debtors' prison as he is not able to pay the bill of the bakery. For his inability to pay the bill in a bakery, Dickens' father was also put into the debtors' prison. And Mr. Pickwick's arrival at debtors' prison is therefore can be described as autobiographical element in the novel. Dickens describes the debtors' prison as a dirty, dark, filthy, cramped and dingy place, full of people, crammed in small spaces. Mr. Pickwick and Sam is first allowed to stay in a room full of boisterous and noisy people. As Mr. Pickwick gets ready to sleep that night, suddenly a boisterous party starts inside that room. The other inmates creates a huge noise, and they all plan to drink at the expense of Mr. Pickwick. Next day, Mr. Pickwick decides not to stay in that room anymore. He is told, Mr. Pickwick is told that if he is able to invest some money, pay some money, he would be able to arrange a separate room for himself. Next day, Mr. Pickwick is thus able to shift to another room. This room is shared by another 3 ruffians, and they also create much trouble for Mr. Pickwick. From then onwards, Mr. Pickwick tries very hard to find a separate room for himself, and ultimately he is able to sublet a room from another prisoner, because the prisoner's whole money is already spent fighting his case. Therefore, Mr. Pickwick lends the prisoner some money and borrows that room from that prisoner, and he stays in that room with Sam Weller. Mr. Pickwick realizes that Sam is a very young man, and as a young man, Sam should not pass his days inside that prison. Therefore, Mr. Pickwick dismisses Sam Weller from Sam's servant's job, but Mr. Pickwick also says that Sam would continue to receive his salary. So, Sam would continue to receive his salary, only he would not have to stay inside the prison with Mr. Pickwick. But Sam did not agree to this proposal. Sam goes out and makes a plan to enter the prison somehow. Sam goes to his father, and both the father and son discuss a plan. Sam then borrows some money from his father, Tony Weller, and he does not return that money to his father. Tony Weller, the father, files a lawsuit, files a case against Sam Weller, and then Sam Weller is also sent to the debtor's prison because he is not able to pay the debt to his own father. So, this is how Sam again comes back to the debtor's prison and starts serving his master, Mr. Samuel Pickwick. This episode shows Sam's loyalty to his master, and this also shows how law could be manipulated in the contemporary England to settle one's personal score, to get one's objective fulfilled. That is how Sam also re-enters the debtor's prison and continues as a servant to Mr. Pickwick. Inside the prison, Mr. Pickwick often visits the quarters, the areas where the poor prisoners are kept. During one of those travels, Mr. Pickwick one day finds Mr. Alfred Jingle and Mr. Job Trotter there. They also have been put inside the prison for some crime, because most of the people in debtor's prison are those inmates who have not been able to pay their debt, repay their debts. Alfred Jingle and Alfred Jingle's servant Job Trotter is also found there by Mr. Pickwick. Both Jingle and Trotter have become very thin and weak physically. They look almost starved, as they have passed many days, many months inside the debtor's prison. They also have lost their vitality, their enthusiasm as cheats, as tricksters. Mr. Pickwick, when sees those two persons who have created so much of trouble for him, he pities them, he shows them compassion, and he forgives them. Mr. Pickwick's encounter with these two persons who have already cheated him for several times, this episode presents another stage in the development of Mr. Pickwick's character. It shows how compassion and forgiveness can lift human beings to another level. Mr. Pickwick decides to help Mr. Jingle and Job Trotter with money. Mr. Pickwick, with the help of Sam Weller, procures the release of these two persons. Mr. Pickwick makes arrangement for the release of Mr. Jingle and Job Trotter from the prison, and also he makes arrangement to send these two people to West Indies for their moral rehabilitation, moral rehabilitation, moral upliftment. And both Jingle and Trotter happily accepts the help offered by Mr. Pickwick. Meanwhile, the lawyers of Dodson and Fogg has been hoping to get some money from the case against Mr. Pickwick. But since Mr. Pickwick has not paid anything to Mrs. Bardell, so the lawyers also have not been able to earn anything from Mrs. Bardell. All their plans have failed of earning money. Since they are not able to get what they has planned, they ultimately sends Mrs. Bardell also to the debtor's prison. It is a kind of poetic justice for Mrs. Bardell. Mrs. Bardell planned the imprisonment of Mr. Pickwick, and ultimately Mrs. Bardell herself is sent into the debtor's prison as an inmate. One day, Mr. Parker, one of the lawyers from the law firm Dodson and Fogg, Mr. Parker arrives at debtor's prison and requests Mr. Pickwick to pay the money which he is supposed to pay because of the lawsuit by Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Parker requests Mr. Pickwick that Mr. Pickwick should not allow a lady like Mrs. Bardell to continue to be inside the debtor's prison. Therefore, Mr. Parker requests Mr. Pickwick at least to pay the lawyer's fee to Mrs. Bardell, so that Mrs. Bardell is able to pay the amount to the law firm Dodson and Fogg, and by doing so, Mrs. Bardell would be able to come out of the debtor's prison. Mr. Pickwick is also informed that if he remains adamant not to come out of the prison and he decides to stay there because of his own principle, he would be spoiling the life of Sam Weller, because Sam Weller would also continue to be inside the prison as long as Mr. Pickwick stays inside the prison. This is the second reason for which Mr. Pickwick is asked to pay the amount to Mrs. Bardell, so that Mrs. Bardell gets some money from Mr. Pickwick, and Mr. Pickwick and Mrs. Bardell both are able to come out of the debtor's prison. There is another reason for which Mr. Pickwick feels that he has to pay the money to Mrs. Bardell to come out of the debtor's prison. Mr. Nathaniel Winkle has already eloped with Arabella Allen, who was staying at Bristol. Mr. Nathaniel Winkle has eloped with Arabella Allen. Arabella Allen's brother, Ben Allen, has already planned that his friend Bob Sawyer would marry his sister Arabella Allen. Ben Allen has been planning the marriage between Arabella Allen and Bob Sawyer. Ben Allen thinks that if Arabella Allen marries Bob Sawyer, Arabella Allen's inheritance of £1,000 would come to Bob Sawyer's pocket, and then Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen would have a safe economic future. But Arabella Allen has already eloped with Mr. Winkle, Mr. Nathaniel Winkle. Mr. Winkle, Nathaniel Winkle, has also married Arabella Allen without the permission of the senior Winkle, that is the father of Mr. Nathaniel Winkle. So, before Nathaniel Winkle has eloped with Arabella Allen, he hasn't taken the permission of his father, and now Mr. Pickwick has the responsibility of convincing both Arabella Allen's brother Ben Allen and Nathaniel Winkle's father, the senior Winkle. This is a third reason for which Mr. Pickwick feels that he has to come out of the debtor's prison, and therefore not because of his own self, because of others, because to help the others like Sam Weller, Mrs. Bardell, and Winkle and Arabella Allen, Mr. Pickwick decides to pay the amount to Mrs. Bardell, and Mr. Pickwick comes out of the debtor's prison. This incident, this episode of Mr. Pickwick's decision to help the three persons to come out of the debtor's prison to help others only, shows how much he has changed as a human being. After coming out of the debtor's prison, Mr. Pickwick first travels to Bristol, where he somehow convinces Ben Allen to accept the marriage between Arabella Allen and Nathaniel Winkle. From there, Mr. Pickwick along with the other Pickwickians group members, they travel to Birmingham. At Birmingham, Mr. Pickwick meets Nathaniel Winkle's father, the senior Winkle. Nathaniel Winkle has to somehow obtain the permission, consent of his father for the marriage with Arabella Allen. If Nathaniel Winkle is not able to obtain the consent from the father, then he would be inherited by the senior Winkle. And because of this reason, Mr. Pickwick arrives there and explains the situation to the father. When the senior Winkle, Nathaniel Winkle's father, comes to know about this marriage, he gets serious, and with a heavy voice he tells Mr. Pickwick that he would think about the matter and inform them later. From Birmingham, the group then comes back to London. When they come back to London, Mr. Pickwick is told that Tony Weller's wife Susan Weller has died, and Susan Weller at the time of her death has left a huge amount of money for both the father and the son, a huge amount of money for Tony Weller and Sam Weller. Tony Weller arrives at Mr. Pickwick's apartment and hands him over the whole money to keep the money. Tony Weller requests Mr. Pickwick to keep all the money. He explains the reason. He says that if widows and spinsters would come to know that he possesses a huge amount of money, all of the widows and spinsters would start running after him. Therefore, he requests Mr. Pickwick to keep all the money. Mr. Pickwick takes the money and says that Sam has to accept all the money and start a new family with Mary. Mr. Pickwick requests Sam to get married with Mary, but Sam Weller says that he would do this later. Meanwhile, Mr. Wardle arrives to meet Mr. Pickwick from Dingley Dell. Mr. Wardle informs Mr. Pickwick that Augustus Snodgrass was planning to elope with Emily Wardle. Mr. Snodgrass was trying to run away with Mr. Wardle's daughter Emily Wardle, and after considering the matter seriously, Mr. Wardle has decided to accept their relationship, and he has already decided to support the marriage between Snodgrass and Emily Waddell. Mr. Pickwick is also happy to know about this consent given by Mr. Waddell to the marriage of Emily to Mr. Snodgrass. In the meantime, the senior Winkle, Nathaniel Winkle's father, he arrives there, and he first accuses Arabella Allen of trapping his son. When Mr. Winkle accuses Arabella Allen of this treachery, of this crime, Arabella herself argues with the senior Winkle. At the same time, Nathaniel Winkle arrives there, and he also argues with his father, and the father, Mr. Winkle, is somehow convinced, and he also decides to support their marriage. Therefore, towards the end, two couples get married, Mr. Snodgrass and Emily Waddell, and Mr. Nathaniel Winkle and Arabella Allen. Mr. Tracy Tubman decides to live a bachelor's life. After all the marriages takes place, towards the end, Mr. Pickwick finally decides to disband the Pickwick Club. He decides to disband the Pickwick Club, and then he purchases a peaceful house at a quiet place called Dulwich, and decides to stay the rest of his life in that house. With this romantic marriages, finally the adventures of the Pickwickians, the novel Pickwick Club, ultimately comes to an end. Thank you for watching.